Good morning, Excellencies, distinguished representatives, ladies and gentlemen. Before we begin the pre-session, we have the honor to be joined by our honorable guest. First, let me introduce him. Mr. Guillaume Gefa Antodoko Andali is currently the chief of the Universal Periodic Review Branch of the Human Rights Council and Treaty Mechanism Division, Office of the United Nations High Commissioner of the Human Rights. He also served as the director of the Human Rights Division of the United Nations Multidimensional and Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, as well as the representative of the UNHCR in Mali. He has been working as an international human rights civil servant with the United Nations since August 1999 in Switzerland, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, and Côte d'Ivoire. Mr. Gefa received a Bachelor of Law degree from the University of Kinshasa, DRC, and Master of Laws from Columbia University School of Law, New York. A lawyer by profession, he has devoted most of his legal career to the defense of human rights, both at national and African levels. As part of his relentless struggle against Mobutu's authoritarian single rule, he founded in 1991 the Zairian Association for the Defense of Human Rights, currently known as Azado, one of the most dynamic human rights organizations in then Zaire, now Democratic Republic of Congo. In recognition of his long-standing struggle for the promotion and protection of human rights, Mr. Ngefa has been honored by several American organizations, such as the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, now Law First, in New York, and the Kennedy Center for Human Rights in Washington. Throughout his career, Mr. Guillaume Gefa has developed expertise in political reconstruction and human rights in post-conflict countries, especially on issues related to transitional justice, the human rights dimension of political and electoral processes, and on practical ways of promoting peace and justice. Mr. Gefa, thank you very much for joining us today. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Distinguished Professor Paolo De Stefani, esteemed faculty, and then Brian, student of the University Degree Study di Padova. It's a profound honor to stand before you online today at the 24th edition of the UPR Padova Model. I want to express my sincere gratitude to the University of Padova for this invitation and for its continuing commitment to advancing human rights education. Returning for the second time to this remarkable initiative is a privilege, and then I'm inspired by the dedication that this university community demonstrates for promoting dignity, equality, and then justice. As you know, the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights firmly believes that education is the foundation of any meaningful advancement in human rights. It empowers young people like you to champion the values of justice and then equality. Amid the complex geopolitical challenges we are facing today, initiatives like the UPR Padova Model are more important than ever. They bridge the gap between academic learning and then the real-world advocacy, equipping future leaders like you with the tools to defend and promote human rights. Since 2018, the UPR department of the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, in collaboration with UPR Info, has supported the UPR Padova Model to build knowledge and then competencies among students, enabling them to engage with the Universal Periodic Review process. Today, you will take part in a transformative exercise simulating the working of the UPR working group, a process that represents one of the most innovative mechanisms in the global human rights system. Before you dive into the dynamic experience, allow me to share with you some key insights into the UPR mechanism and then highlight recent successes that underscore its significance. The Universal Periodic Review, as you know, is a unique and an inclusive process. It reviews the human rights record of every UN member state, ensuring that all nations, big or small, rich or poor, are held accountable for their international obligations. This mechanism fosters dialogue, mutual accountability, and concrete actions. Since its inception in 2008, the UPR has reviewed all 193 UN member states multiple times. By 2027, all states will have completed 4 review cycles. In the first 3 cycles alone, over 93,000 recommendations were issued, with an impressive 75% of them accepted by states. This high acceptance rate demonstrates that UPR effectiveness in fostering political commitment and then catalyzing reforms. But the UPR success is not built on numbers alone. It's built on its ability to generate real, tangible changes in the lives of people. Let me share a few recent examples that illustrate this impact. Take Sudan, for instance. In its most recent UPR session, the world's attention focused on the grave human rights challenges posed by an ongoing conflict. The UPR process highlighted the urgent need to protect women, children, and other vulnerable populations. Following these discussions, Sudan committed to working with regional partners and then UN agencies to combat sexual and then gender-based violence, improve humanitarian access. While much work remains, these steps are vital for addressing immediate human rights concerns. In Afghanistan, the UPR brought global attention to the erosion of women's and then girls' rights. Several states called for the restoration of access to education for girls and the protection of women human rights defenders. These recommendations have mobilized international support, including initiatives to fund grassroots organizations that provide education and vocational training for women and then girls. The UPR has been instrumental in keeping the plight of Afghan women and girls on the global agenda. And let us celebrate Sierra Leone, a nation that recently abolished the death penalty, a milestone directly linked to UPR recommendations. This decision marks a significant step forward, not only for Sierra Leone, but also an example for other nations to follow. Finally, UPR has amplified, as you know, the voices of small island nations like Tuvalu and then Maldives, where the intersection of climate change and human rights is a matter of survival. During the reviews, these nations emphasized the urgent need for international action on climate resilience. As a result, commitments from member states were made to fund programs addressing loss and damage, showcasing how the UPR brings attention to emerging global challenges. These examples demonstrate the power of the UPR to effect meaningful change. Yet the UPR's success relies on more than just states. It depends on the active engagement of stakeholders like civil society organizations, national human rights institutions, and then individuals. It also depends on you, the next generation of human rights defenders. Through this simulation, you have a unique opportunity to step into the roles of diplomats, advocates, and then change makers. You will experience firsthand the challenges and opportunities of working within the UPR mechanisms, but more importantly, you will discover your own potential to contribute to the cause of human rights. I urge you to fully embrace this experience. Learn from it, engage with it, let it inspire you to take an active role in defending and promoting human rights in your future endeavors. Each of you has the capacity to make a difference, and then the world needs your voices, your energy, and then your commitment. Before I end my small speech, I would like again to commend the leadership of Professor De Stefano, who have been a driving person in this exercise. It will help us to see how we can learn not only in theory, but in practice, and then also contribute to the practices that will shape the future for the forthcoming fifth cycle. Again, thank you for your dedication for this vital cause. Enjoy this transformative experience, and I look forward to seeing the incredible impact we have on the future of human rights. Maybe some of you will be joining us as interns or staff at the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ngefa. It is my privilege to declare the pre-session of the Universal Periodic Review of November 19, 2024 in Padova open. I warmly welcome you all. Okay. I invite the Vice President, Abdelrahman Zein, to introduce the guidelines for today's pre-session. Mr. Vice President, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President. Good morning, Excellencies, distinguished representatives, and honored guests. We would like to remind all participants to wait for acknowledgement from President prior to presenting. Please do not interrupt or talk until you're officially given the floor by the President. For the presentation portion of today's pre-session, we kindly ask the representatives from the INGOs or NHRIs announced by the President to stand up, walk over to the podium on my left, and wait for the timer to start, and then you can begin your presentation. During your presentation, please refer to the delegates as fellow delegates of, for example, fellow delegates of Armenia. And refer to the President of the session as Madam President. We would also like to remind participants that the use of mobile phones during the session is prohibited. Punctuality is also extremely important throughout the entirety of the simulation. Please ensure that your team is punctual in arriving at the correct location, signing in and recovering their badges prior to start, and in order to ensure that your team is full reception of participation points. We'll start every day on time, regardless if every team is here. Thank you in advance for your adherence to the rules, and I give the floor back to Madam President. Madam President, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Before we proceed with the reports of the international non-governmental organization and the national human rights institutions, I remind you that the performance of each team during the simulation, be it NHRIs, INGOs, or state, will be evaluated. The presentation of the civil society organizations will last no longer than 10 minutes. First, non-governmental organization will be called to present their reports, and then we will have a short coffee break. Afterwards, the pre-session will proceed with the reports of the national human rights institutions. Moreover, I would like to reiterate that the Universal Periodic Review recognizes the vital role of the national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations in the reviewing process. They provide additional clarification to the human rights issues on the ground that might be raised during the working group sessions. Accordingly to the Human Rights Council Resolution 1621, the Council strongly rejects any acts of intimidation or reprisal against individuals and groups who cooperate with the United Nations. The Universal Periodic Review urges states to prevent and ensure adequate protection against such acts. We shall now begin with the presentation of the international NGOs. I will call the representatives by name, and I apologize in advance for my mistakes, for the mistakes I might make. CARE International, Mrs. Raffaella Maria Barbara Paiva Francisco Samperugini, as Senior Advocacy Advisor for CARE International. Mrs. Marina Garcia Cunha as Global Policy Communication Director for CARE International. Greenpeace, Mr. Federico Di Leonardo is the Research Coordinator of Greenpeace. Mrs. Denise Mendoza, Human Rights and Environmental Officer. At Right International, Madame Kirsty, sorry for my pronunciation, Hati Kiprayu, Senior Program Officer at Right International, and Mrs. Isabella Zimanska, UN Program Officer at Right International. Oxfam International, Mrs. Francesca Sabia, holding the position of Human Rights Executive Director and Policy Advisor-in-Chief. Mrs. Erika Locarini, fulfilling the role of Monitoring and Evaluation Specialist. Penal Reform International, Mrs. Veronica Garbing, serving as Global Policy Manager for Penal Reform International, and Madame Teresa Kurka, serving as Policy and International Advocacy Manager for Penal Reform International. Refugees International, Mrs. Margherita Boy, serving as Executive Director of the Refugee Advocacy Lab, and Mrs. Sofia Galante, serving as the Senior Advocate and Program Manager. Now I invite to the floor the Global Policy and Communication Director of CARE International, Madame Marina Cunha. Madam Director, you have 10 minutes. You may take the floor.
Good morning, Madam President, Mr. Vice President, Your Excellencies, and esteemed colleagues. I'm Marina Garcia Cunha, the Global Policy and Communications Director for CARE International. It's an honor to address you today on behalf of our organization, which is dedicated to improving the lives of women and girls in some of the world's most vulnerable communities. Established over 75 years ago, CARE International operates in more than 100 countries worldwide, implementing programs that promote social justice, gender equality, and economic empowerment. We focus on key areas such as combating gender-based violence, enhancing healthcare access, and supporting women's leadership. Through partnerships with local communities, civil society organizations, and governments, CARE has made measurable strides in alleviating poverty and addressing systemic inequalities, ensuring that the voices of women and girls are central to development and humanitarian efforts. I stand before you today to highlight some critical issues concerning gender inequality and its profound impact on the rights and well-being of women and girls in Armenia, Kenya, and Turkey. In the framework of the United Nations Universal Periodic Review, this report seeks to bring attention to the progress made, as well as the challenges that persist in addressing gender-based inequality in these countries. Despite some advancements, the situation of women and girls in these nations continues to demand our collective attention and action. Armenia has taken important steps towards gender equality by introducing a 33% gender quota for political representation. However, women's participation in political and public life remains limited. As of 2023, women hold only one of 12 ministerial positions and represent just 26% of the judiciary, with limited presence in senior roles. Moreover, women's leadership at the local level is similarly underrepresented, with only one female governor and 8 women in community leadership positions. To address these disparities, it is crucial not to only enforce gender quotas, but also foster capacity building and incentives for women to take on leadership roles in both political and community settings. The situation is even more alarming when it comes to sexual and gender-based violence. Although Armenia's criminal code addresses crimes related to sexual freedom, there is a critical gap in legal provisions addressing domestic violence and harassment. Without the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, Armenia risks remaining without a comprehensive framework to prevent and respond to violence against women. Furthermore, healthcare services, although free for pregnant women, remain inaccessible for women with disabilities and incarcerated individuals. This reflects a broader systemic issue of inadequate services and discriminatory practices that prevent vulnerable women from accessing their basic rights. Therefore, we urge Armenia to strengthen accountability mechanisms to ensure the implementation of gender quotas at all levels of government, introduce incentives or capacity building programs to encourage women's participation in community leadership roles, amend the criminal code to explicitly address domestic violence and harassment, enabling effective legal action and aligning it with international standards. Ratify the Istanbul Convention to align national laws with international standards on preventing and combating violence against women. Ensure better healthcare access for marginalized women, including those with disabilities and incarcerated individuals. And finally, implement mandatory training programs focused on the healthcare needs of women to reduce discrimination and improve the quality of care. Turning to our fellow delegates of Kenya, the government has made significant strides in terms of policy and legislation. The introduction of the National Policy on Gender and Development, the Gender Mainstreaming Policy, and the National Reproductive Health Policy demonstrate Kenya's commitment to gender equality and women's empowerment. However, challenges remain, particularly in the areas of HIV prevention and gender-based violence. Women and girls remain disproportionately affected by HIV, with 66.7% of new infections in 2021 occurring among this group alone. Although some programs, such as the use of vaginal rings, have been introduced, they are insufficient to reverse the alarming trends. It is vital that the government expand HIV prevention programs, especially for young women, and integrate them into broader sexual and reproductive health services. While Kenya has made commendable progress in tackling gender-based violence, with initiatives such as specialized courts and the establishment of polycare centers, the situation remains dire. Conjugal violence and femicide continues to rise, and there is an urgent need to scale up these efforts, ensuring that the newly established polycare centers are fully operational and accessible across the country. To further advance gender equality in Kenya, we recommend expanding targeted HIV prevention programs for young women and integrating them into sexual and reproductive health services, ensuring the full implementation of the National Reproductive Health Policy with specific attention to marginalized women, strengthening national awareness campaigns on gender-based violence and gender equality to address harmful cultural norms and behaviors, ensuring the functioning and expansion of polycare centers across the country, and adopt a gender-centered approach to policies and legislation. In Turkey, the situation is particularly concerning. While the government has committed to addressing gender-based violence, the country's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention in 2021 has raised alarms. The lack of a comprehensive legal framework and the insufficient response to domestic violence leave many survivors without protection and justice. In addition, there is a significant gap in services, particularly shelters for women facing violence. Despite a legal guarantee for shelters in municipalities with populations over 50,000, there are only 33 shelters in the whole country, many of which are operating at full capacity. Migrant and refugee women face additional barriers, including discrimination and limited access to services, which further exacerbate their vulnerability. We call on Turkey to reconsider its decision to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention, and as this decision directly undermines efforts to protect women and girls from violence. Furthermore, we urge the government to ensure adequate funding for enough safe shelters nationwide, with culturally sensitive services for vulnerable groups, especially migrant women. Prioritize programs that enable women's economic empowerment, enabling them to escape abusive situations. Ensure the 24/7 enforcement of protection orders for all forms of violence against women. And finally, combat the impunity for gender-based violence by strengthening legal enforcement and prosecution of perpetrators. Finally, CARE International remains committed to working in partnership with government, civil society organizations, and international bodies to advance the rights of women and girls. We stand ready to collaborate with Armenia, Kenya, and Turkey to support their efforts in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly Goal 5 on gender equality. In conclusion, while we recognize the efforts made by all countries, we must acknowledge that the journey towards full gender equality is ongoing and requires urgent action. By strengthening legal frameworks, improving service provision, and addressing the root causes of gender-based violence, we can ensure a future where every woman and girl has the opportunity to live free from violence, discrimination, and inequality. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Director. Our second speaker today is the Human Rights and Environmental Officer for Greenpeace, Madame Denise Mendoza. Madame Mendoza, you now have 10 minutes. You may take the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Today, I am honored to be in presence with the Universal Periodic Review Secretariat, Madam President, Mr. Vice President, countries delegations, national human rights institutions, and other international organizations. My name is Denise Mendoza, and I am the Human Rights and Environmental Officer for Greenpeace International. It is a pleasure for me to be present to the floor and on advancing access to clean water and indigenous rights. Access to clean water is a fundamental right. Yet, millions of people, particularly in indigenous and marginalized communities, face significant barriers due to climate change, environmental degradation, and socio-political constraints. Greenpeace has advocated for environmental issues for over 5 decades. Our notable successes include the Clean Water Project in the Philippines, where we collaborated with communities and experts to address water contamination and secure sustainable access to clean water. Building on this experience, we are here to advocate for actionable solutions to improve water access and protect the rights of vulnerable populations. The objective of our presentation is to assess the current state of clean water and indigenous rights in El Salvador, Kenya, and the Maldives. We aim to identify gaps in existing frameworks and propose sustainable, rights-based and solutions to address these challenges. We cannot stop here, and we have a lot of work to do, especially in El Salvador, where over 50% of the rural population lacks access to safe, clean drinking water. This issue disproportionately affects indigenous communities, such as the Lenca Nahuatl people, who rely on natural water sources contaminated by industrial pollution and pesticides runoff. Climate change increases these challenges with prolonged droughts and uneven rainfall. While El Salvador has made some progress by recognizing water as a constitutional right, enforcement remains inconsistent and infrastructure investment are insufficient. On the other hand, Kenya faces severe water scarcity, particularly in arid and semi-arid regions. Indigenous groups like the Maasai often rely on natural water resources that are prone to drying up. Women and children bear the burden of walking long distances to fetch water. While Kenya has made some strides in water resources management, these efforts often exclude these indigenous perspectives, resulting in inequitable solutions. Formal recognition of land and water rights for indigenous communities remains critical to addressing these challenges. And last but not least, the Maldives is among the most climate vulnerable nations in the world. Over 80% of its islands are at less than 1 meter above sea level, making rising sea levels a significant threat. Desalinated freshwater aquifers, the primary drinking water source for many islands. Outer islands like Kafue Mafushi face additional challenges due to limited infrastructures and poor waste management. Greenpeace recommends the following. For El Salvador, we recommend to recognize and enforce water as a constitutional right, strengthen regulations of industrial pollutions, improving ruling water infrastructure, and mitigate pesticide runoff. For Kenya, we recommend to establish drought release resilient water systems, formalizing land and water rights for indigenous groups, and ensuring indigenous perspectives are integrated into water governance policies. For the Maldives, we recommend to expand renewable energy power desalination projects, enhancing water storage infrastructure, and developing waste management centers to prevent water contaminations. However, we do not want to do this by ourselves. Our efforts are amplified by the strategic collaborations with Oxfam International with expertise in water access and poverty alienation, Procuraduría para la Defensa de los Derechos Humanos en El Salvador, a vital ally in addressing water pollution, and Human Rights Commission for the Maldives, advocating for climate resilience measures and highlighting the urgency of water access challenges. Water is a basic human right. Our advocacy and main challenge focuses on the urgent need of action for El Salvador, Kenya, and the Maldives. We urge states to adapt our recommendations, emphasizing sustainability, equity, and together, I am sure that we can ensure water justice to everyone and guaranteeing all the benefits for dignity and highlights the importance of quality of life. Thank you.
Thank you, officer. I now invite to the floor Madame Krisi Hatsikiprayu, Senior Program Officer at Outright International. Madam Aksihipirayu, you have 10 minutes. You may now take the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, Mr. Vice President, esteemed Secretary, delegates, and representatives. Please allow us to thank you for the opportunity to address the UPR today in order to advocate for human rights. Outright International is a human rights organization that operates as a consultant within the United Nations Economic and Social Council. Our work is dedicated to unmasking human rights infringements and promoting LGBTIQ+ advocacy, specifically regarding gender expression and identity, sexual orientation, and sex characteristics. This report aims to shed light on the lives of the queer people residing in Turkey, Spain, and El Salvador, along with the number of recommendations the state ought to at least consider, if not apply, in accordance with their obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. In Spain, Outright International sees a collaborator, a long-lasting fighter for equality and justice, and a great partner in promoting the worldwide dialogue about human rights. That is exactly the reason why we chose to further push them with our recommendations. We believe that Spain has the potential to become a safe haven for all queer individuals. Their commitment to protecting and promoting the rights of LGBTIQ people has been substantiated. Spain legalized same-sex marriage in 2005, becoming only the third country in the world to do so, while simultaneously allowing same-sex couples to adopt. In the last UPR in 2020, the state answered and supported the Armenian proposal to take further steps to promote tolerance and non-discrimination. In accordance to that, in June of 2022, a comprehensive bill was passed, including anti-discrimination practices based on sexual orientation, gender identity, HIV status, and any other personal condition or circumstance in employment and provision of goods and services. It also imposed a ban on conversion therapy and all non-consensual medical practices. However, even if they are legally protected, queer individuals and specifically transgender people to this day face a number of challenges. Recent modifications speak loudly about Spain's engagement in anti-discrimination policies and genuine interest. In February of 2023, the Spanish Parliament voted for a law titled "For the Real and Effective Equality of Trans People and for the Guarantee of the Rights of LGBTIQ People." Social prejudice, however, and abuse remain. Latest studies, for example, have shown that homophobia and transphobia, especially in sports, is an unsteering problem that many refuse to even discuss. New initiatives, as for example, the creation of Spain's first all-transgender soccer team, aim to acclimate society to the new, more inclusive norms. Also notable and equally concerning is the growth of online hate and hate crimes towards the LGBTQ individuals, in particular transgender and intersex people, which have led to very serious incidents, including the suicide of a 12-year-old boy in February of last year. As we move forward with the recommendations, we firmly ask Spain to take further measures to advocate for young people about the consequences of hate, bullying, and violence, including but not restricted to the LGBTIQ community. Human rights education is vital, as nowadays society is struggling to keep up with its own fast progress. Additionally, Spain must become actively engaged in new legislative propositions banning the so-called parental veto, which prevents underage people from getting education on topics regarding sexual orientation and gender identity. Finally, we urge Spain to take additional action to help bring awareness to discrimination against transgender and intersex people, especially in sports. In Turkey, LGBTIQ rights have been under attack for many, many years. While same-sex relations are not outlawed, queer people continue to face oppression, prejudice, and violence at an alarming rate. The ruling party has for many years now ignored efforts and requests from other political parties, activists, and NGOs to include references to sexual orientation and gender identity in their constitution. Along with the absence of legal protection and the lack of ban on conversion therapy and non-consensual medical procedures, queer individuals have had to tolerate systematic and legal discrimination, have been victims of hate crimes, and have faced persecution of the right to free speech and assembly, among others. the absence of laws protecting individuals against discrimination based on gender expression, identity, or orientation, the state-enforced censorship, and the use of hate speech, even by government officials, showcase Turkey's unwillingness to apply the previously proposed recommendations, which during the past UPR were over 20 regarding LGBTIQ rights. The annual Pride March has always faced persecution in Turkey. Starting in 1993, the state restricted and detained LGBTIQ people intending to march, and for the next 10 years, no one dared to try again. While the momentum picked up between 2003 and 2013, in 2014, on the preface of Ramadan-related sensitivities, the authorities prohibited the march and forcibly dispersed protesters with water cannons and tear gas. Since then, there have been continued bans against pride marches in multiple cities and systematic attacks by law enforcement against demonstrators. In 2022, the police once again violently cracked down on pride, beating marches and arresting 530 LGBTIQ marchers and rights defenders in 37 days. Thus, we want to re-emphasize that the state of Turkey must introduce constitutional anti-discrimination clauses in all areas of life, including decision-making, employment, education and health based on gender identity, sexual orientation, and sex characteristics. Turkey must also condemn the hate speech and hate crimes towards the LGBTIQ community, investigate and prosecute any such cases, and deliver justice to those who have been wronged, no matter the perpetrator. The Turkish government must impose a widespread ban on non-consensual medical interventions and harmful practices and guarantee the freedom of assembly and peaceful protest for all its citizens. The state of El Salvador has made little progress regarding LGBTIQ rights in the past few years, as popular and it appears legislative also resistance has slowed the momentum significantly. While same-sex relations are not illegal, there is no legal recognition or protection measures in place, setting society back in its efforts to progress. One can find a number of studies and programs meant to promote inclusivity, equality, and no discrimination, some even by government institutions. However, no active measures have been implemented to guard those in danger. The mistreatment and detainment of LGBTIQ activists, the absence of protective policies, the lack of legal gender recognition, all point to the state of El Salvador not taking the recommendations previously posed seriously enough. A 2017 Ministry of Justice and Public Security report highlighted that LGBTIQ people experience multiple forms of violence, including acts of torture, resulting to many fleeing the country in fear of persecution. While in 2022, the Supreme Court ruling determined that the National Assembly must facilitate the change of legal gender identity on the basis of it being discriminatory, the latter did not follow through with a deadline and no measures were taken. The state of El Salvador was also urged during the previous UPR to combat discrimination and violence based on gender identity. However, in February of 2024, the government banned the discussion of LGBTIQ topics in schools and dissolved the Ministry of Social Inclusion. The current government, who, before running for presidency, promised to be on the right side of history concerning LGBT rights, has done the complete opposite and began advocating against marriage equality, and once elected, effectively shut down the government's sexual adversity work. Our recommendations then for the state of El Salvador include the recognition and prohibition of all types of discrimination and violence based on sexual orientation or gender identity, and the assurance of secure, unbiased, and equal conditions for all. In addition, the state of El Salvador should ensure proper education on sexual orientation and gender identity in schools, protecting young people that are part of the LGBTIQ community from discrimination, hate, and bullying. Protection of LGBTIQ rights defenders and activists from political restrictions and violence, ensuring freedom of speech in the state of El Salvador must also be considered effectively. In conclusion, Outright International firmly believes that all above-mentioned countries must implement and practice administrative policies against the discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. They are also urged to conduct and facilitate the investigations of instances of harassment, abuse, violence, or any other form of persecution, and must aim to prosecute perpetrators to ensure justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Arsigibraiu. The following presentation will be held by Madame Francesca Sabia, Human Rights Executive Director and Policy Advisor in Chief. Madame Sabia, you may take the floor. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President, Honorable Vice President, Secretariat, Excellencies, and distinguished representative all. I'm Francesca Sabia, Human Rights Executive Director and Policy Advisor-in-Chief for Oxfam International, and on behalf of the delegation with my colleague Enrico Luccherini, the Monitoring and Evaluation Specialist, I'm honored to speak at today's Universal Periodic Review reviewing Turkey, Kenya, and El Salvador. Oxfam International is a confederation of 20 organizations working in over 70 countries. Oxfam work spans humanitarian relief, development, and policy advocacy, aiming to empower those who face the greatest challenges in accessing their basic rights. Today, we direct the Council's attention to the urgent cross-cutting issue of food insecurity. This critical human right, as recognized by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 25, and reiterated by FAO's guidelines, is often overshadowed but deeply impacts multiple aspects of the life of the most vulnerable categories: women, migrants, children, the elderly, and indigenous people. In this Universal Periodic Review, Oxfam's focus is on ensuring that food security is recognized as an inalienable human right and fully respected by the international community and the states under review, which presents diverse yet interconnected challenges where specific social, political, economic, and environmental conditions amplify food insecurity. Let us first address Turkey, a nation currently facing the aftermath of devastating earthquakes in 2023, which internally displaced 3.3 million people, combined with the over 4 million refugees already present due to regional conflicts. Turkey's food system and resources are under unprecedented strain. Arid land covering 65% of the country and highly vulnerable to erosion further threaten food access for the 82.6% of small-scale farmers who make up over 2 million people dependent on agriculture. Past UPR recommendations have largely overlooked food insecurity, focusing on general displacement-related issues like housing and health, as included in Joint Submission number 8 to the Council in 2015. The lack of explicit attention to food security is a serious gap, given that the right to food underpins many other rights. Oxfam strongly urges the adoption of the following measures. First, agri-food rural assistance. Strengthening food productivity can be achieved through small investment and cash assistance directed at enhancing water system infrastructure and providing agricultural machinery in rural areas. Second, food chain enhancement. Optimization of resources through circular food economy will minimize waste, promote efficient use of resources with the food chain. Providing training and education on agriculture best practices will create socioeconomic opportunities that are equitable and accessible. This, in turn, enables more individuals to contribute effectively to the agri-food sector. And third, humanitarian aid and food security. The recent earthquake in 2023 has exacerbated the food access challenges for refugees and survivors. Implementing food storage hubs, rapid food distribution networks, and distributing daily meal vouchers ensures that affected populations have consistent access to essential food supplies. Providing also clean cooking facilities and sanitary assistance, it will also support safe and nutritious food preparation, which is crucial for health and recovery in disaster-affected areas. Moving to the second state under review, currently, 39.4 million Kenyans, approximately 72.8% of the population, are affected by moderate to severe food insecurity. Over half of Kenyan population lives below the poverty line, and less than 22% of Kenyan children have access to a safe and nutritious diet. Key factors exacerbating this situation include climate extremes, currency depreciation, and insufficient technological progress within the agri-food sector, and also social marginalization, particularly affecting the Maasai community and women. Additionally, 40% of agricultural products are lost due to resource mismanagement, which further compounds these challenges. Moreover, the World Food Programme has indeed been considering Kenya for several years now a hunger hotspot of major concern on the brink of famine. In previous UPR cycles, the government was encouraged to pass legislative reforms and social support programs initiatives. Despite this, the food security bill, a core component of Kenya's Big Four agenda, remains pending. Moreover, the National Agricultural Investment Plan and National Food and Nutrition Security policies, as well as social meals and national safety net programs, were implemented only in a limited capacity. To address the ongoing challenges and build on past recommendations, Oxfam proposes, first, the adoption of legislative, institutional, and economic measures. We urge Kenya to implement the Food Security Bill, the National Agricultural Investment Plan, and fully scale the National Safety Net Program. These measures should include accountable monitoring through audit procedures and ad hoc committees to ensure transparency and effectiveness. Moreover, in alignment with the African Union Malabo Declaration, we recommend the establishment of a National Food Security Council to drive policy coherence and draft a biennial strategy to strengthen national food security. Second, building agri-food resilience. To support this, we advocate for new technologies, including weather forecasting stations in rural areas, geospatial imagery systems, and drone technologies for land management, drip irrigation, and drought-resistant crops, example given cassava, fonio, sorghum, and millets, as well as aquaponics. And third, to protect vulnerable groups, we strongly recommend extending the school meal programs to all schools nationwide. This will reduce incidents where young girls are coerced or sexually taken advantage of near poor slums in exchange for a portion of food granted to these young women. The fourth recommendation is overcoming nutritional deficiencies. Addressing nutritional gaps is critical in high-risk regions like Garissa, Turkana, Wajir, Marsabit, and Mandera. We propose the distribution of biofortified seeds, protein-rich foods and milk supplements for infants in these food insecure areas. And finally, promoting a circular agri-food chain by converting waste into biogas for clean cooking. And in rural regions like the Rift Valley, we recommend the use of crop residues and manure as natural fertilizers. Finally, the last state under review is El Salvador. El Salvador's food crisis is rooted in an outdated economic model that has long neglected public investment in agricultural sector. Moreover, once a producer of its own foods, the country now relies heavily on imports, resulting in significant losses in productivity and economic opportunities. Moreover, despite producing over 80% of the food consumed in El Salvador, smallholder farmers remain the most likely to face hunger themselves. Additionally, El Salvador's geographic location along the dry corridor with El Niño phenomenon leave it highly susceptible to extremes like climate events exacerbating food insecurity. In previous UPR cycles, the right to food was only briefly addressed in one recommendation, which failed to account for specific needs of vulnerable groups or the intersection of food insecurity and climate change. Oxfam calls for the targeted recommendation to be prioritized. First, supporting smallholder farmer agricultural target programs by providing access to essential resources such as seeds, tools, and credit, comprehensive training on sustainable agricultural practices, market opportunities to ensure fair practices and economic stability. Second, the climate resilience strategy, integrating food policies with climate adaptation strategies to mitigate the impact of extreme weather events. And key actions include improved water management, like investing in irrigation system, rainwater harvesting, as well as in resilient agri-food infrastructures. And last recommendation, securing food accessibility by strengthening supply chain logistics and food distribution systems to ensure equitable access to food by enhancing transportation infrastructure, which would facilitate food delivery across the region with no losses. In conclusion, the delegation believes that access to adequate food is fundamental to human survival and human dignity, social stability, and peace. Oxfam delegation is standing in front of this Human Rights Council session, calling for actions and practical and proactive engagement by the international community in achieving this inalienable and transversal human right. Only when everyone, everywhere, will not suffer from hunger, and it is possible to affirm that the right to food has equally been ensured. Let's leave nobody behind. Let's not fail on the people most in need, starting from all of us taking actions in this room. I thank you for the attention.
Thank you, Madame Sabia. Next, I invite Madame Veronica Garbin, Global Policy Manager for for Penal Reform International. Ah, Teresa Cucca. Sorry for the mistake. The floor is yours, Madam Cucca. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you. Madam President, Mr. President, esteemed fellow delegates, I'm here on behalf of Penal Reform International, that is an NGO that works globally to promote criminal justice systems that uphold human rights for all. Because criminals are persons, they are not just a person who committed a crime. We work globally to make criminal justice systems non-discriminatory and protect rights of disadvantaged people with a particular gender-sensitive approach. And we run practical human rights programs and support reforms that work in that sense. From this year, Penal Reform International is implementing a new 5-year plan that runs until 2028, aiming to reform criminal justice, putting human rights at the very core by promoting rehabilitation and reintegration and empowerment rather than sterile criminalization. We believe that this will help to cut the incredibly high percentage of reoffending by focusing on re-education rather than on sterile punishment. It is significant that penal reform put at the heart of its strategy this humanizing approach. We also involve people and former prisoners in the reform because we believe that their participation is crucial. Unfortunately, we in our report this year, we found that criminal measures globally are increasingly being applied in a discriminatory manner, targeting vulnerable groups within weak justice systems. And this results in several shortcomings in fundamental human rights. For this reason, and following the 5-year strategy, we decided to focus for this session on Turkey, El Salvador, and the Maldives. So about Turkey. In Turkey, it will seem that there are instances of ill treatment and torture on a widespread basis, as well as a lack of accountability from the authorities. And there have been also reports of arbitrary and unlawful detentions, particularly targeting minorities, human rights defenders, in particular LGBTQI human rights activists, and the media. Turkey has jailed the most journalists globally last year, and academics and foreign nationals, particularly Syrians and Afghans. There has also been a widespread use of incommunicado detentions, which we want to stress expose detainees to increased risks of torture and other abuses. The authorities have not investigated these allegations of abuses duly. We also found a rise in the proportion of foreign nationals, which we are deeply concerned of, since the percentage is very high, and it's of 258% in the proportion of foreign nationals incarcerated. This led us to concerns of the discriminatory applications of the legislation, particularly of the anti-defamation and anti-disinformation and anti-terrorism legislation, which particularly targeted the Kurdish part of the population. Several NGOs, including Amnesty International, in the past years have been accused of terrorism. We also found an excessive use of pre-trial detention, which came up to 7 years. And we also want to note that the criminal liability age is still 12. Basing on our findings, we would like to recommend Turkey to implement an effectively independent and impartial monitoring system for human rights within the country, whose representative should not be chosen by the government. So that prisoner conditions could be effectively monitored and investigations, reporting, and fighting the fight of impunity could be effectively implemented. We also advise to narrow the definition of terrorism so that the discriminatory application of the legislation could be limited. And we also advise to raise the age for criminal liability, and we recommend that even the people accused of terror-related offenses are provided fundamental fair trial rights. As regards El Salvador, it has been reported that during the state of emergencies, which lasted for the last 2 years, there have been prolonged detentions and arrested contravening fundamental fair trial rights. We are deeply concerned by the widespread use of mass trials with preliminary hearings where public defenders had a limited time to present collective cases, and people were convicted basing on their affiliation to a certain organization rather than on personal culpability. Also, it has been found discriminatory application of the anti-gang legislation to justify detention and intimidate political activists and journalists. The overcrowding in El Salvador of the detention facilities is the highest in the world, with 300% of occupancy rate and the highest rate of incarceration, with over 1% of the population detained in prison. There have been allegations of torture and ill treatment, which led to 190 deaths since the beginning of the state of emergency. Therefore, we would like to suggest the restoring of fair trial rights, and that all arrests are led in accordance with Article 9 of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. And as practical guidelines, we advise to take into account the Bangkok and Mandela rules. And in order to address the overcrowding, we advise to decriminalize the exercise of fundamental freedoms, such as the freedom of assembly, and to implement alternative measures to detention, such as house confinement. For the Maldives, there have been instances of unlawful detentions targeting political activists, LGBTQ community, and individuals with migration concerns, who were not provided prompt legal access and the chance to challenge their charges. Often they didn't even know what the charges against them were. We also found restrictions on press freedom and arbitrary detention and arbitrary arrest and prolonged detentions targeting journalists. And we are deeply concerned also about the situation of migrant workers who are frequently detained on grounds related to their migrational background. And we also found alarming that access to healthcare, even the most basic and in emergency cases, was denied. And therefore, we advise to comply with the standards of the International Convention of Political and Civil Rights, defining further what probable and reasonable grounds for arrest are, and informing the detainees of the charges against them so that they can challenge them, increasing right to counsel and consular access for foreign nationals. As a practical guidance, we advise to take into account rules 24 and 27 of the Mandela rules and the guidance of the Convention Against Torture. We also advise to implement a national preventive mechanism to ensure transparency, and so that international standards in detention facilities can be effectively monitored. As Penal Reform International, we remain available to collaborate to implement practical human rights programs in implementation phase following this session, and to offer our expertise on the field. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Cucca. Now we will hear from Madame Margherita Boy, Executive Director of the Refugee Advocacy Lab for Refugees International. Madame Boy, please take the floor. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President, Mr. Vice President, esteemed Secretary, and distinguished delegates. I am Margherita Boy, and I'm honored to represent Refugees International. And together with my colleague Sofia, we have analyzed the situation of migrants in Spain, Kenya, and Turkey. Where is it? It's not. No, don't worry. But I can go without if you want. Okay. Sí, sí. No.
Now you may take the floor.
Okay, thank you. So, as we all know, the condition of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers are a challenge that states continue to face. And for the majority of them, the situation is aggravating due to the inadequate actions taken by them. So first of all, the first country we wanted to analyze is Spain because of the increasing arrivals of migrants, both by land and by sea, coming from Latin America and from the African countries. We all know that the journey to get to the Spanish territory is extremely dangerous, considering especially the length of the route from Morocco to the Canary Island. And in the past 2 years, there's been an average of 33 deaths per day registered. The primary entry points are the Canary Islands and the two enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla in Morocco, where the living conditions of migrants are highly concerning in the SETI, the temporary migrant reception centers, and they are worsening because of the overcrowding. In the past years, also the number of unaccompanied minors has increased, and their situation is especially at high risk of exploitation and abuse, especially also when they arrive in the Spanish territory. We have also encountered a concerning backlog in the Spanish asylum system that results in a huge number of pending applications. Even though we want to thank Spain for the efforts that he has made in the improvements of the past UPR recommendations, because of the challenges explained before, we want to make some more recommendations. So first of all, we ask to the state to increase the resources and the staffing to address the asylum backlog to finally unlock all the pending applications that it encounters. Second of all, we ask the Spanish government to improve the living conditions in the SETI and to grant the access of specialized staff in the centers, especially to protect the child and migrants. And finally, we ask Spain to ratify the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of the Family, the CMW. Moving to Kenya, we want to thank and we want to recognize that Kenyan government has made some enhancements over the past 4 years, like having continued to partnership with international humanitarian agencies, especially since the adoption of the Refugee Act 2021, which allows a series of rights to the refugees if this act were to be fully implemented. Indeed, the act is on the whole very vague, and at the same time, the Department of Refugee Services, the DRS, lacks the real capacity of imposing some effective policies. However, Kenya still faces some challenges due to climate change that especially affect refugee camps, and it hasn't made any significant change in preventing and combating sexual and gender-based violence. For these reasons, the recommendation we would like to make to the Kenyan government are the following. First of all, we ask the Kenyan government to sign the CMW as for Spain before. Second, we ask the Kenyan government to turn the Refugee Act into some more concrete actions by constituting a real comprehensive refugee policy and by giving a real definition of what the refugeehood consists of. And we also ask the Kenyan government to elevate the DRS into an independent and autonomous actor, making it able to coordinate with other branches of the government and with external humanitarian actors. Finally, we ask the establishment of a rigid control of gender-based violence in the camps through the deployment of national and international experts. Finally, moving to Turkey, we want to stress how the situation of migrants hasn't improved since the past UPR cycle. And on the contrary, it might also have been worse, considering the 2023 earthquake and the war in Palestine that affect in large number the number of migrants. Turkey still has the biggest influx of refugees in the world, with approximately 4 million refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants arriving, the majority of which are from Syria. It's with immense discontent that we haven't seen any improvement since the past UPR cycle, while the situation of migrants, especially Afghans and Syrians, has also worsened, with numerous violations of the principle of non-refoulement, according to the Article 33 of the Geneva Convention, and of discrimination against them, since they've been evicted from refugee camps after the 2023 earthquake to make space for Turkish survivors. Furthermore, Turkey still doesn't meet the minimum standards on the elimination of human trafficking, a practice that is increasing more and more due to the instability and uncertainty of migrants, and to the fact that laws regarding the release of working permits are not very effective and comprehensive of refugees. This has led also to an increase of premature marriage of young girls, a thing that we consider especially concerning. We recognize that Turkey has established, however, some anti-trafficking shelters. The recommendation we want to move to the Turkish government are similar to the ones made in the previous UPR cycle, since it hasn't improved in the majority of them. The first one is to improve the legislation and the control over human trafficking and sex work by creating an institution devoted to the matter. The second one is to stop the violation of human rights standards and therefore to stop the repatriation of migrants and especially of Afghans and Syrians. And the last one is to combat the gender-based violence on women and on the LGBTQI+ community in camps. We want to thank for your attention, and this is.
Thank you, Madam Boy. Thank you all for giving us insights into the human rights issues on the ground that needed to be addressed. I am now closing the first part of the pre-session dedicated to the reports of the INGOs. We now have a coffee break before we proceed with the presentations of the NHRIs. I kindly request everyone to be back at 11 o'clock. We will start without any delay.
We start in 2 minutes. Excellencies, distinguished representatives, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I now declare the second part of the pre-session dedicated to the presentations of the national human rights institutions open. I would like to take a second to remind states to remain attentive, engaged during today's presentations as your performance is being evaluated today as well. I also remind the NHRI representatives that you each have 10 minutes to present the reports. So we'll start with the human rights defenders of the Republic of Armenia. We have Leah Shendel, serving as the human rights defender of the Republic of Armenia, as well as Finja Somerhej, serving as advisor to the human rights defender of the Republic of Armenia. There's, for the state of Salvador, we have Daniel Lonzano, head of projects and management of cooperation. Alicia Gruman, deputy attorney for the defense of human rights. Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. We have Dakota Zehler serving as the chairperson for the KNHCR. Ms. Natalie Montenegro serving as the chief policy researcher for KNHCR. The Human Rights Commission of the Maldives, Ms. Maria Chiara de Cristofaro, who will serve as the executive director for the HRCM. Ms. Agatha Siciliot, serving as the director of the research and policy for the HRCM. Then we have Defensor del Pueblo, Spain. Ala Duab, serving as the first deputy. And Filippo Romei, serving as the second deputy. The Human Rights and Equality Institution of Turkey, the Ms. Francesca Bianchini, serving as the coordinator of the International Relations and Project Unit. And the last speaker of the day is Claudia Quesaroto, serving as the research coordinator of the Protection and Promotion of Human Rights Unit. To start, I invite Madame Leah Schnedel, the Human Rights Defender of the Republic of Armenia. Madame Director, please take the floor, and you have 10 minutes for your presentation.
Mr. President, Madam Vice President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates and representatives. I'm speaking to you today as the human rights defender of the Republic of Armenia to advocate for the rights of the most vulnerable citizens and to present a comprehensive overview of Armenia's human rights challenges and confront the systemic issues that demand our urgent attention. It is my hope that by openly addressing these imperative issues, we can contribute to a constructive dialogue and work towards actionable solutions that steers Armenia towards comprehensive, inherent rights for all. The underrepresentation of women in leadership and decision-making roles remain an obstacle in Armenia's campaign towards increased human rights, as significant structural barriers for women remain, despite a slight increase in the percentage of women in middle management roles and the adoption of a national strategy for gender equality. Women in Armenia are at an increased risk of gender-based violence, as justice and support systems continually fail to those affected by this widespread issue. A robust monitoring system to track progress on gender equality, coupled with tangible goals, such as achieving a minimum of 40% representation of women in leadership positions, is essential to foster a society where equality is fully realized in practice, not just in principle. Achieving gender equality requires addressing all forms of inequality, including the injustice faced by the LGBTQ+ community in Armenia. This marginalized group continues to experience widespread discrimination and violence, with only 10% of reported cases being investigated. These issues are aggravated by societal stigma, with only 20% public support and the weak enforcement of existing protections.
such as the inclusion of hate speech provisions in the criminal code. Recognizing homophobia and transphobia as exacerbating factors in hate crimes is not merely a legislative necessity, it is a moral imperative. A national action plan to combat violence and hate speech against individuals of LGBTQ+ community would serve as a powerful testament and crucial first step towards our shared community to inclusivity. In this context, it becomes increasingly important to address the rights and needs of the most vulnerable of society, children. Especially refugee children and those with disabilities face disproportionate challenges, including limited access to education and essential services. Progress has been made through psychosocial and educational support initiatives and the State Program for the Development of Education in the Republic of Armenia until 2030. Ensuring comprehensive support for children in poverty, as well as establishing a juvenile justice system, are crucial steps to improve the situation of young individuals in Armenia. Throughout Armenia, nearly 192,000 individuals with disabilities face barriers to accessing much-needed services that allow them to participate fully in society. Bureaucratic obstacles, coupled with inadequate support systems, only deepen their marginalization. By implementing a disability system reform in 2023 and adopting the International Classification of Functioning, Disability and Health Framework, Armenia has made necessary changes. But the implementation of targeted policies for social inclusion and the development of a comprehensive anti-discrimination policy are vital steps towards the inclusion of people with disabilities in society. As we reflect on these systematic barriers, we must also turn our attention to the distress of refugees and migrants. Armenia has provided vital assistance to over 100,000 displaced ethnic Armenians from the contested Nagorno-Karabakh region. Basic needs such as clean sanitation facilities and functional kitchens remain unmet for many, and more than 80% rely on state support. In response to the refugee movement, Armenia has implemented crucial measures, including educational support for more than 15,000 displaced children and the hiring of displaced teachers to maintain access to education. Ratifying the International Convention on Migrant Workers' Rights and developing a national WASH strategy are essential measures to uphold the dignity and fundamental rights of refugees and migrants. Tackling domestic violence is essential for building a society where individuals can live without fear and danger. Legal reforms expanding the definition of violence to include psychological and economic abuse and the criminalization of stalking represents progress. However, enforcement of these reforms remain inconsistent, and survivors still face barriers to protection and justice. For instance, 39.5% of women report experiencing abuse. Yet, courts sometimes overturn intervention orders. Ratifying the Istanbul Convention is an urgent step that would signal Armenia's commitment to aligning its domestic policies with international standards and ensuring comprehensive protection for survivors. Conversation around safety and accountability would be incomplete without addressing police violence. Abuses targeting civilians, lawyers, and judicial personnel, as well as systemic impunity, arbitrary detentions, and excessive use of force continue to undermine trust in law enforcement. Although disciplinary proceedings under the Ministry of Justice to promote accountability took place, establishing an independent oversight body to investigate cases of abuse and ensure accountability is essential to rebuild public confidence in the Armenian police force and uphold the principle of justice and fairness. Human trafficking for forced labor and sexual exploitation continues to impact women, children, and marginalized communities disproportionately. While progress has been made through the adoption of the law on identification and support of persons exposed to human trafficking and the 2023 to 2025 national program, as well as awareness campaigns and training for frontline workers, challenges persist. To address these gaps, it is vital to strengthen victim identification and reintegration services and ensure consistent enforcement of existing legislation through robust monitoring mechanisms. Freedom of expression, a fundament of human rights, faces significant challenges in Armenia. Independent media grapple with political polarization, legal pressures, asset freezes, and occasional violence, while movement restrictions and the law on state secrets limit press freedom. The government has initiated public discussions on media regulation and supported fact-checking platforms to counter misinformation. However, reforming the law on state secrets to promote transparency and enhancing legal protection for journalists against harassment and arbitrary lawsuits remain critical to safeguard this fundamental right. Mr. President, Madam Vice President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, and representatives. As the human rights defender of Armenia, my responsibility is to ensure that the mentioned issues are brought to light, not simply to draw criticism, but highlight the numerous opportunities of meaningful change. These challenges reflect systematic gaps without society that demand collective effort to address, improve, and resolve the root causes of injustice felt by so many. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Director. Next speaker is Mr. Daniel Lonzano, the Human Rights Defender of the Republic of El Salvador. Mr. Director, please take the floor. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President, Madam President, distinguished delegates, and esteemed colleagues. It is an honor to address you today on behalf of the Procuraduría para la Defensa de los Derechos Humanos de El Salvador. Through this speech, we aim to shed light on the progress made, the challenges faced, and the critical steps that lie ahead to ensure the full realization of human rights in El Salvador. Since the last Universal Periodic Review in 2019, El Salvador has improved in certain areas. However, several challenges remain and they demand our collective action and attention. Today, we will address key areas of concern, including civil rights and political rights, economic and social rights, the protection of vulnerable populations, public safety, and environmental rights. One key area of this realm is the security and public safety. While El Salvador has achieved significant reductions in gang violence, the state of emergency has brought about new human rights challenges. Efforts to combat gang violence have led to the mass detention of individuals, often without the process or sufficient evidence. Also, allegations of abuse by security forces underscore the need for accountability and oversight. Since the state of emergency, the Procuraduría para la Defensa de Derechos Humanos launched a national verification program to follow and ensure accountability. As you can see in the chart, in less than 1 month, 34 cases of violation on fundamental rights have been reported. So you can see a significant concern on today's fundamental rights protection. We continue to talk about the realm of civil and political rights. One of the cornerstones of democracy is the protection of civil and political rights. While El Salvador has taken steps to address these issues, concerns persist. For example, journalists and civil society actors continue to face harassment, surveillance, and restrictions that undermine their work. A proposed foreign agents bill in 2021, though shelved, poses a future risk if proposed against during state of emergency. The independence of the judiciary is fundamental to upholding the rule of law. Instances of political interference and lack of transparency in judicial appointments have raised alarms. Additionally, reports of mass detentions and allegations of torture during the ongoing state of emergency highlight the urgency of addressing this issue. Then we go to economic and social and cultural rights, which are essential for the dignity and well-being of all individuals. Despite progress, challenges persist, particularly in education and labor rights. We can highlight, for example, the first quality, education, where access to quality education remains uneven, especially in marginalized and rural areas. Infrastructure deficits and safety concerns exacerbate the problem. Labor rights, cases such as exploitation and lack of enforcement of labor protection hinder the realization of fair working conditions. Followed by the rights of vulnerable populations, including women's rights and gender equality. We still see gender-based violence, limited political participation, and restricted access to reproductive health services as remaining critical issues. Indigenous people, where land disputes and inadequate protections for cultural heritage continue to marginalize indigenous communities. And finally, LGBTIQ+ rights. Despite previous recommendation, discrimination and violence against LGBTIQ+ individuals persist. Last but not least, environmental rights and climate change. The intersection of environmental degradation and human rights is an urgent matter for El Salvador. We've seen some government initiatives to actively protect water resources and reduce pollution and deforestation. Also, there are ongoing programs to address industrial pollution and climate mitigation. However, due to limited resources, its effectiveness may affect the expected outcome. For this, we acknowledge the importance of an extra help. This is where we look to accomplish key partnerships to address the ongoing problems. We look for partners like Penal Reform International, Oxfam, and Greenpeace. By holding bilateral and multilateral meetings, we aim to strengthen El Salvador justice system in line with global standards, improve climate change programs, and reduce the consequences provoked by it, assuring that vulnerable populations can adapt and overcome these challenges. In conclusion, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, and esteemed colleagues, together we can ensure that human rights are not merely aspirational, but are realized in practice, transforming lives and fostering resilience in the face of our shared challenges. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Lonzano. I invite the President of Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, Madam Dakota Zehler, serving as the chairperson for the KNHCR, to represent the report. The floor is yours.
Mr. President, Madam Vice President, honorable delegates, distinguished guests, and respected peers. The Kenyan National Commission on Human Rights is honored to have the opportunity, but more importantly, the responsibility to present to the UPR the current state of human rights in our nation. Our presentation will highlight the progress and challenges faced in 3 human rights topics deemed most pertinent, most urgent, and most representative in the developments since the last third cycle review. As designated by the Constitution of Kenya to be the national human rights institution, the Commission is committed to our task and duty of advocating and securing the human rights of all Kenyans. We take pride in our A status accreditation and work tirelessly to live each and every day by our motto, human rights for all of the time. Beginning with accountability for extrajudicial killings, torture, and enforced disappearances, progress has been made through the establishment of the National Task Force to review key operations of institutions such as the National Police Service and Kenyan prison system. Furthermore, a working group was established to operationalize the National Coroner Service Act, an important piece of legislation that's used to investigate all sudden, violent, or suspicious deaths within our nation. However, challenges remain. Particularly in the implementation of the National Coroner Service, where a reviewing body, the one previously mentioned, cited inadequate funding and endemic corruption as hindrances to the full realization of that law. Additionally, the Prevention of Torture Act, once a very promising piece of legislation, now 7 years old, has yet to see anybody charged under its authority. And the Kenyan National Commission of Human Rights has been denied in multiple instances the ability to act as a monitoring institution of detention facilities. Nothing highlights this further than the most recent 2024 anti-finance bill protest and underscores the grim reality and dire consequences of this inadequate implementation during the time. In our darkest hour, the Commission used its constitutional powers to move the court on habeas corpus for further accountability of the actions of police during these protests. However, the consequences seen today are not a discussion here on this global forum, but rather 50 mothers of dead children with little to no postmortem explanation to their loss. And furthermore, families face a much crueler fate, still waiting for answers of where their kin has gone and why they have not returned, living in a state of purgatory between grief and yearning, a life that I would not wish upon any one of you. The Commission recommends, in the strongest possible rhetoric, to operationalize and fully enforce the National Coroner Service Act, and to furthermore ratify the optional International Convention of the Protection of Persons Against Enforced Disappearances, which the government was a signatory of more than 16 years ago, and through 10 explicit recommendations across 3 UPR cycles, has not taken action upon. On the topic of the rights of the child and juvenile justice, we'd like to highlight great strides that the government has taken, particularly the Children's Act of 2022, which harmonized and extended existing legislation, particularly on the rights of intersex children. Additionally, the action plan to end child marriage was without a doubt commendable. Although the practice has been illegal since 2014, actions taken to make sure that this is uniformly enforced is something of great importance. The Commission has also noted existing challenges with these. Intersex children are still victims of non-consensual surgeries and marginalized in their access to education, employment, and financial services. Child marriage also still takes place due to the lack of uniform enforcement nationwide, especially in rural areas. Due to antiquated and illegal cultural norms, these problems persist. The Commission recommends to expedite amendments to the Children's Act to more clearly define intersex as a third gender marker, to also equally and properly enforce the existing child marriage legislation, and finally, to ratify the optional protocol on the human rights of the child on the topics of the sale of children, child pornography, and child prostitution. These are the future educators, leaders, and advocates for justice and equality in our society. How can we give them this responsibility in unjust circumstances that our current nation faces? On the topic of gender-based violence, it remains an issue of critical importance. Sensitivity programs on female genital mutilation, increased legislation on gender-based violence, and the establishment of polycare centers, a holistic center where survivors can receive police, legal, psychological, and health services, are a completely amazing achievement. When looking at the challenges, though, current legislation still faces gaps in forms of nationwide enforcement and implementation due to a lack of resources and communication between different authoritarian bodies. Furthermore, polycare centers have only 2 operational facilities nationwide. With a population of over 52 million in an area of over 580,000 square kilometers, it's clear that although progress has been made, many survivors are still marginalized and underserved. To highlight further, in January of this year alone, there were 16 individuals killed in direct correlation to gender-based violence. 1 month. The Commission recommends, in the strongest terms, to investigate, prosecute, and convict perpetrators of sexual and gender-based violence, including female genital mutilation, indiscriminately. Additionally, the Commission would recommend the establishment of safe houses for all victims and survivors so that resources are available in times when these individuals are most vulnerable, and they can find solace and protection in their institutions that they believe in. The Commission leaves you now with a vision of our institution for all Kenyans, where human rights are upheld indiscriminate of your age, ethnicity, creed, gender, or location. Only as humans, on common ground, a mission to create a better society for ourselves and our posterity, can we achieve these goals. Now to you, esteemed delegates, the task at hand is to review, which is the only time where we can actually reflect on progress made and decide where we will guide ourselves in the future and create better standards for that shared future. We urge you to remember in the following days that human rights are for all of the time. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zahler, and sincere apologies for the wrong title due to unfamiliarity with the nature of the name. Now we move on to the following presentation from the Human Rights Commission of the Maldives, the Executive Director for the HRCM, Maria Chiara de Cristofaro. Madam Executive, I pass the floor to you.
Thank you, Mr. President, Madam Vice President, Secretary, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, esteemed colleagues, all. Thank you for joining us today. I am Maria Chiara de Cristofaro, Director of Advocacy and Outreach, and with Agatha Ceciliet, Director of Research and Policy, I'm presenting an overview of the Human Rights Commission of Maldives' recent national report. This report offers a comprehensive view of the current human rights landscape in Maldives, including achievements, ongoing challenges, and areas needing further attention. The report reflects our dedication to promoting human rights across civil, political, economic, social, and environmental domains, emphasizing both the progress made and the reforms still required. Let me begin with a question for all of us today. What does it truly mean to protect human rights in the 21st century? It is simply about policies and promises, or it's about standing with those most in need, amplifying their voices, and ensuring their dignity in the face of immense challenges. Today, I ask you to reflect on this question as we turn our attention to the Maldives, a nation whose struggles against systematically inequities and this climate crisis compel us to act with urgency. Let me ask you this. How free is a society if journalists are silenced, if voices of distance are mute, and if justice feels out of reach for so many? In the Maldives, we have seen progress. Restrictive media laws have been repealed and public engagement has grown. Yet, journalists and human rights defenders still face intimidation and arbitrary detention. Would any of us accept this in our own nations? I invite you to consider a solution. What if we could establish a robust mechanism to protect journalists? One that ensures their safety and accountability for those who threaten them. Together, we can make this a reality. In the judicial system, too, there is a work to be done. Imagine being detained for months, maybe years, without trial, knowing your fate lies in the hand of a system influenced by external powers. This is the reality for many in Maldives. Let us commit to supporting reforms that build trust in their justice system. A transparent and independent judiciary is not just an aspiration, it's a necessity. Now, let's talk about basic rights. Think about healthcare and education in your own communities. Are they accessible? Are they equitable? For many in the Maldives, especially those on remote islands, the answer is no. For instance, imagine a parent on a remote island watching their child fall in, knowing the nearest healthcare facility is hours away and poorly equipped to help. This is a daily reality for many Maldivians. I ask you, what if we could change this? By investing in climate-resilient healthcare systems and digital learning platforms, we can bring the gaps and give every Maldivian access to the services they deserve. Let me pose another question. Who speaks for the vulnerable? For women facing violence, for children at risk of exploitation, for persons with disability and migrant workers who are too often overlooked. Take a moment to think about a woman in the Maldives, a survivor of domestic violence. Now, imagine, she has no shelter to turn to, no support system to help her rebuild their life. Would we accept this for our mothers, sisters, or daughters? We must demand more resources for shelters and support services, gender-sensitive law enforcement, and policies that empower women economically. And what about migrant workers? Picture someone who has left their home to build a better life, only to face unsafe conditions, unpaid wages, and no legal resource. Would we allow this exploitation at our own borders? To protect them, we need stronger labor laws, housing standards, and guarantees access to healthcare. The Maldives' economic success depends on these workers, and we owe with them dignity and fairness. Now, I want you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You're standing on a pristine Maldivian beach, the sun setting over turquoise water. But then, the tide rises higher than it should. The shoreline shrinks. Salt water seeps into the soil, and soon, that very beach is no more. This is not an hypothetical scenario. For the Maldives, this is their reality. Rising sea levels, coastal erosion, saltwater intrusion threaten not only their land, but their identity, culture, and livelihoods. Let me ask, what if this were your home? Would you wait for the tides to consume it? The Maldives is leading by example, advocating for environmental conservation and sustainability, but they cannot do it alone. They need our support for climate adaptation projects, sustainable tourism, and international cooperation to combat this existential crisis. We recommend to adopt comprehensive reforms in order to align national media laws with international standards, ensuring freedom of expression for journalists and human rights defenders. Again, we recommend establishing independent monitoring and complaint mechanism with the judiciary. And again, we recommend to expand education access and quality by investing in teacher development and digital learning platform, especially in remote regions. Additionally, we recommend to enhance funding and resources for shelters and supporting services for survival of domestic violence, as well as reinforcing gender-sensitive training across law enforcement agencies. We recommend to expand resources within the juvenile justice system, increasing oversight and funding for child protection services, and developing comprehensive reporting and support framework for at-risk children. We recommend to integrate disability rights within public policy frameworks to guarantee equal access to service and infrastructure. In conclusion, we recommend to enhance climate adaptation efforts through international cooperation and prioritize environmental protection policies that promote sustainability. Let me end with one final question. When history look back on us, what will our legacy be? Will be remembered as bystanders or as a global community that rose to the challenge? The Maldives is not just a symbol of vulnerability, it's a symbol of resilience. But that resilience must be met with action. Let us commit to supporting the reforms, amplifying their voices, and protecting their future. The Maldives is calling, and the question is, will we answer? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Di Cristofaro. Our next speaker for today is Mr. Ala Duab, serving as the first deputy ombudsperson of Defensor del Pueblo. Mr. Duab, the floor is yours, and you have 10 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. President, Madam Vice President, estimated Secretariat, honored guest. I am Duab Ala, and I'm representing today the Spanish Ombudsperson. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, it is an honor to address the Assembly on behalf of Defensor del Pueblo, Spain. Defensor of the Pueblo, Spain. Guided by our constitutional mandate, our role is to safeguard fundamental rights and of all individuals residing in Spain, advocate for vulnerable population, and ensure accountability in the implementation of Spain's human rights obligation. Guided by principles of justice, equality, dignity. Today, I will present an overview of Spain's current human rights situation, focusing on key challenges and giving recommendations to the Spanish states that we think that must be implemented. Our methodology to write this report was developed through a rigorous methodology to ensure accuracy, impartiality, and the data collection involved primary resources such as UN treaty bodies, UN agencies such as the High Commissioner of Human Rights, UN Agency for Refugees, and also reports from the Interior Ministry, Ministry of Justice, and Ministry of Equality. Our secondary resource was also some reports from Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. Validation was conducted through internal expert reviews. Our findings draw from key international resources, including European Convention on Human Rights, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the UN Convention Against Torture, and Spain's commitment to the Global Compact Refugees. Our key focus areas is civil and political rights, social, economic, and cultural rights, and rights of vulnerable population. For the civil and political rights, freedom of expression and assembly, Spain remains committed to upholding democratic principles, yet challenges persist. The Spanish Constitution provides freedom of assembly, and the authorities typically respect this right. However, the Public Safety Act that took effect in 2015 imposed a number of restrictions, including fines up to 600 euros for participating in unauthorized protests near key buildings or infrastructures. This act, also known as the gag law, can be interpreted in a way that can implicitly limit this right of freedom of assembly. Concerning police conduct and accountability, ensuring transparency, police operation and implementing effective complaint mechanism is necessary to foster trust and accountability within the communities. Significant progress has been made, such as introducing body cameras and independent oversight bodies. However, while the Defensor del Pueblo was handling individual complaints, reports of excessive force, particularly in interaction with migrants and protesters, has been shown. And having a law enforcement with accountability can help us to entrust the relationship between communities and authorities. Economic and social rights. Concerning right to housing, housing insecurity remains a significant challenge in Spain. Disproportionality affects low-income families, migrants, and refugees. In 2022, 26% of the population was at risk of poverty or social exclusion, with 7.7% experiencing severe deprivation, particularly in southern regions and single-parent households. Despite the government efforts, including the new house law in 2023 to increase public housing and regulate evictions, implementation gaps persist. Many vulnerable communities lack access to basic utilities like electricity and water. Concerning the right to education, although Spain's constitution guarantees the right to education, structural inequalities persist, particularly for migrant children and low-income families. Socioeconomic backgrounds remain a decisive factor for educational outcomes, with students from low-income households dropping out rates 5 times higher than their peers from higher-income families. Limited barriers include resource for individualized education and inadequate transition support from education to employment. The Defensor del Pueblo also notified disparities in access to education, especially in regions with high migrant population and low-income families. Increased funding for public schools and teacher training programs is essential to close this gap. Concerning labor rights, Spain didn't ratify yet the International Convention for Protection of all Migrant Workers and their family members. While the Spanish state has introduced reforms to combat precarious employment, asylum seekers face unnecessary barriers to labor market access. Current laws require 6 months before accessing to the labor market. The Defensor del Pueblo thinks that a direct access to the labor market could facilitate the integration and economic independence of the asylum seeker, so we can have an adequate life and could process his life independently. It is fundamental also to talk about climate justice and migration, since it's in a big important intersection about these two issues. While Spain's climate justice efforts often focus on emerging economies, domestic vulnerabilities remain unaddressed. Low-income and minorities groups are particularly at risk from natural disaster. What happened a few weeks ago in Valencia is the concrete example. It's exacerbating existing inequalities, so Spain must adopt proactive, sustainable solutions, including urban planning and infrastructure to support population movement to safer region. Collaborative efforts with international partners are essential to develop sustainable solutions that mitigate this risk. Protection of vulnerable population, migrant refugees and asylum seekers. Spain's role as a key migration entry point brings unique challenges. While progress has been made, pushbacks at borders at Ceuta and Melilla continue to undermine the international obligation, including the principle of non-refoulement. We urge the criminalization of pushbacks and call for legislation to strengthen accountability for border practices, especially when the Guardia Civil took decision to push back asylum seekers, which is an administrative decision. Extradition is an administrative decision, and authorities taking this decision is a right violation for the Spanish Constitution and the Spanish Penal Code. Detention conditions. In the detention center, the Defensor del Pueblo notified an overcrowding and limited access to legal aid remain significant concerns in Spain. Reports highlight deficiencies in facilities like the CATES, Centros de Atención Temporal de Extranjeros, including risk to health and inadequate protocols to identify vulnerable people, such as pregnant women or asylum seeker. Acting under its mandate as Spain National Prevention Mechanism against torture, Defensor del Pueblo conducts visits to these facilities to ensure that conditions comply with the international rights standards, particularly the UN Convention Against Torture, which Spain has ratified. These visits have revealed the need for stricter oversight, better regulation, and resource for consistent monitoring, ensuring that detainees, especially asylum seekers, are identified and transitioned in a proper asylum procedure without being penalized is essential in order to protect the principle of non-penalization. And also, there is a need for an inclusion and an integration plan to be adopted. Detention is not the solution. Considering the right of the children, in the Islas Canarias, the last report shows that a lot of unaccompanied migrants were being detained with adults without any age assessment. And the Article 17 of the Spanish Civil Code grants also nationality to children born in Spain under specific condition, which is not the true on the implementation ground, because a lot of stateless people, children that were born during the migratory trip couldn't have the citizenship. Our recommendation. We recommend to expand legal service and language training and social integration programs for migrant and asylum seekers. Grant immediate labor market access to asylum seekers upon application submission. Criminalize pushbacks, uphold non-refoulement obligation through comprehensive legislation at border authority training. Simplify and expedite family reunification process prioritizing vulnerable cases.
Thank you, Mr. Daib.
Thank you.
We will hear the last presentation from the representative of the Human Rights and Equality Institution of Turkey, the coordinator of the International Relations and Project Unit, Ms. Francesca Bianchini, and I ask her to take the floor. You have 10 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. President, Madam Vice President, esteemed Secretary, and fellow delegates. I am honored to speak on behalf of the Human Rights and Equality Institution of Turkey. I'm Francesca Bianchini, and as the coordinator of the International Relations and Project Unit, along with my colleague Claudia Cesarotto, the researcher coordinator of the Protection and Promotion of Human Rights Unit, are eager to present a report tackling the Human Rights Institution in Turkey and accordingly to address recommendations to the competent delegations. The Human Rights and Equality Institution of Turkey was established in 2016 under Law number 6701 as a public legal entity with administrative and financial autonomy. Our mandate is clear: to protect human rights, to promote equality, and to combat torture and ill treatment. We fulfill this mandate by reviewing individual applications, conducting investigation, and raising public awareness. Additionally, we contribute to national educational curricula and provide legislative options to the Turkish government. Our work aims to foster a society where every individual can live with dignity and equality. The Human Rights and Equality Institution of Turkey achieved significant progress by earning a B status accreditation from the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions in 2022, signaling compliance with most international standards. However, a key concern remains. Our independence is undermined by the President's direct role in appointing board members, as stated in Article 10, Paragraph 2 of the law, of the establishing law. For the Human Rights and Equality Institution of Turkey to achieve full compliance and gain a full A status, we recommend amending this law, particularly as concerns appointment procedures, so as to ensure complete independence from political influence. Gender-based influence and discrimination are a pressing issue in Turkey.
National strategies and actions plan were adopted in this area, which still needs to bear credible results. Deeply rooted gender stereotypes still highly prevents progress towards gender equality, as evidenced by official data. Only 30.4% of women aged 15 and older were employed in 2022, compared to 65% of men. Also, illiteracy rates among women aged 25 and older remain disproportionately high at 5.7%. Turkey's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention on Prevention and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence in 2021 exacerbated the issue. And since then, femicides have steadily risen, with 205 women killed in the first half of 2024 alone. And this is particularly worrying, especially considering that Turkey is a party to the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. We therefore recommend rejoining and enforcing the Istanbul Convention, explicitly criminalizing domestic violence and fully implementing the Women's Empowerment Action Plan. Turkey Constitution and Law 6701 prohibit discrimination based on race, religion, and gender in its Article 3, yet implementation gaps persist. After January 2020 review circle, Turkey launched a National Action Plan on Human Rights, and Goal 4.4 of this plan aims at improving the effectiveness of the fight against hate speech and discrimination. However, hate speech against ethnic minorities and the LGBTQ+ community remains prevalent, and existing anti-discrimination laws do not adequately protect sexual orientation or gender identity. We recommend revising Law 6701 to focus solely on the human rights and equality institution of Turkey establishment and mandate, while drafting a separate legislation to cover equality and anti-discrimination comprehensively. Additionally, we urge Turkey to ratify Protocol number 12 of the European Convention, which establishes a general prohibition of discrimination. Torture and ill treatment remain serious concerns in Turkish prisons. As of law number 6701, the Human Rights and Equality Institution Board retains duties as a national preventive mechanism, including the assessment of application received within the National Preventive Mechanism scope. The Human Rights and Equality Institution reported that in 2020, it received 175 applications. 504 petitions were submitted, 2,245, of which were forwarded to relevant authorities, especially the Ministry of Justice, General Directorate of Prisons and Detention Houses. The majority of applications alleged ill treatment, mostly on ground that prisoners did not have adequate access to healthcare. In 2022, the Human Rights Foundation of Turkey reported 1,079 cases of physical and psychological torture. In 2023, 567 oral cavity searches and 240 complaints about restricted fresh air were recorded. To address this issue, we recommend implementing stronger monitoring systems, holding law enforcement accountable, and also ensuring timely investigations into torture allegations. These steps align with Turkey's obligation under the UN Convention Against Torture. To summarize, we propose 4 key recommendations. Firstly, to ensure that the Human Rights and Equality Institution of Turkey's independence by amending law number 6701. Secondly, we encourage Turkey to rejoin the Istanbul Convention and strengthen the gender-based violence protection. We also encourage and recommend Turkey to expand anti-discrimination law to include protection for sexual orientation and gender identity, and to improve monitoring and accountability to combat torture and ill treatment. These recommendations aim to create a more just and equitable society in Turkey. In conclusion, the Human Rights and Equality Institution of Turkey remains committed to fostering a society rooted in equality, dignity, and justice. And achieving this goal require collaboration between national institutions and international stakeholders. Together, we can address these challenges and ensure that human rights are upheld for all. If you'd like further information, you can contact our institution at the details provided in the slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Madame Bianchini. Thank you all for these enlightening presentations and for giving us an opportunity to learn about the human rights situation in your respective countries. The Secretariat appreciates your dedication to contribute to the Universal Periodic Review and looks forward to seeing how it unfolds. Since all the INGOs and NHRI presentations are over, I now declare that the session is now closed. The lobbying session is done behind the scenes and it will not be open to the public. The lobbying will start at 2 p.m. at the Human Rights Center of the University of Padova. And we would like to remind you that lobbying occurs between the representatives of the INGOs or the NHRIs and the recommending states only. Please respect the time slots you reserved through the Excel sheet and on Moodle and in an orderly manner. So I can see that we are slightly ahead of the schedule, but please be back at the premises ideally by 1:45, and you will be guided to the lobbying site by our colleagues after the lunch break that is starting at 12:30. And of course, we'll be starting on time. And the researchers conducted online, I want to thank you and see you tomorrow. And wish all of you a successful lobbying sessions and a nice afternoon. Goodbye.